Progress was made overseas in Davos last week. Trump left the World Economic Forum with a framework for a deal on Greenland. The island will stay under Denmark's control, but the U.S. is expected to gain access to its minerals and also gain full sovereignty over U.S. bases. Now, Trump touting the agreement by saying it gives the U.S. everything that is needed, and he dropped tariffs against European countries. But other geopolitical risks remain. Trump sent a naval armada towards Iran and is threatening Canada with a 100% tariff if they make a deal with China. Well, joining me to weigh in this morning is Patrick L. Young, chairman and founder of Exchange Invest. Patrick, good morning. Thank you so much for joining me. Well, Davos is finally in the rearview mirror. No tariffs on European nations with a U.S. deal on Greenland. So tell me about the framework, and do you think the framework primarily is about defense and countering Russia and China, or do you think it leaves the door open to greater U.S. control of Greenland in the future?
Look, ultimately what Trump has been looking for here is access to rare earths. We know Greenland has a large number of those because, in fact, rare earths aren't actually that rare once you allow people to mine for them. That's just an ecological paradigm. The second thing is obviously the Arctic Circle becomes increasingly important. Trump wants to get as much access to that as possible in order to counter particularly Russia, but also Chinese influence in the area. The Greenland deal allows him to do that. And therefore, it was great to see a pragmatic European, Mark Rutte, standing up and realizing that ultimately the United States pays for NATO. It manages to defend the world. And at the same time, therefore, it was specious nonsense that was being spouted by the Europeans in the whole episode. So what we've got is a great framework of a deal, a thoroughly comprehensive approach, and in fact, something that could have been agreed weeks ago with a lot less wailing and gnashing of teeth if the Europeans had been more pragmatic earlier.
Yeah, and Patrick, so many headlines coming through, but regarding headlines of a U.S. military aircraft traveling in waters near Cuba, this does come at a time and against the backdrop of regional tensions as well as closely watched military movements in the Caribbean. So do you think the U.S. aircraft carrier is in Cuban or actually in international waters here?
Look, here's a very simple situation. We've got several dynamics going on. First of all, the dynamic politics of the Caribbean have changed immeasurably because previously they had a lender of last resort in the form of oil and gas, which was the Venezuelans. That spigot is being turned off because Maduro is now in custody. And despite the Chavistas still being nominally in charge of the country, they're not going to do anything to upset the Americans. The Americans are back in Caracas, baby. They've got a fully fledged embassy running with, well, it would seem to us, a lot of Secret Service men making sure that the Venezuelan government is adhering to the rules as the Americans see it. What's going on the USS George Washington, which is an aircraft carrier, which is about the size of a small Polish mercantile city. I'm in Poland today. That is doing effectively figures of 8 around and about Cuba. What's it doing? Well, it's the old-fashioned Robert De Niro and Meet the Fockers. The Americans are going like this to Cuba. They know that the Cubans are up against it. And of course, when your Secretary of State is Marco Rubio, a Cuban American, what could be better? This year is a regime change year. We've seen something happening in Venezuela. It's quite plausible it's going to happen in Cuba, and that's going to reshape the Caribbean more in American interests, which obviously is also part of rebutting China.
Well, Patrick, it's definitely a region we're keeping our eyes on, but as we continue our trek around the globe, let's focus on the Middle East. So last week, Trump stating the U.S. is sending an armada to the Middle East, and this did raise concerns of possible action against Iran. So do you think this is a possibility and there could actually be military action against Iran?
I think that's a very interesting dynamic here. I'm not convinced there is going to be military action against Iran per se. I think that what's happened is when you've got 100 refueling carrier aircraft alone in the region, it is clear the Americans have come up to the Iranian borders and they're shouting blood, blood, blood. The bunker busters are in the hood. Everything is there, including the armada that you mentioned, if the Iranians don't want to play ball. Ultimately, though, also Trump will understand the Iranians are a very proud people. The Persians do not want to be seen to have their government overthrown by overseas. But by putting this pressure on and all of the geopolitical pressure that has been happening in recent months, what's happening? Well, first of all, the Americans are distributed right across the Middle East. What does that tell us? It tells us that everybody is looking for regime change across the Middle East, because clearly a large number of hosts to American bases are fully aware that the US is amping up the pressure on Tehran and the mullahs. And it could well be, I think, that we are looking at the last days of the Islamic regime.
Well, Patrick, I do want to round out our discussion by looking at America's neighbor to the north, in particular Canada. So Trump's threatening 100% tariffs, but Canada is saying it has no intention of pursuing a free trade deal with China, with Carney saying that the government is honoring its trade commitments. And this does come on the heels of Carney speaking at the World Economic Forum. So tell us what's going on here.
Well, look, Mark Carney wants to get elected in Canada. He presumably wants to get re-elected. He's managing to beat the drum in a nationalistic fashion. But ultimately, Canada remains the GDP rounding error of North America, pro rata, despite the fact that it's one of the 10 largest economies on earth. So what have we got? We've got the ultimate end of a new world order. Carney was bang on about that. The thing that was quite hilarious was that it was ultimately just another case of smoke and mirrors in an everyday world, which is actually Trump world, being dominated by the US regime, whether we are in the Middle East or elsewhere, and ultimately obscuring from the exciting stories that have been going on over the course of the last week.
And finally, before I let you go, one quick question here. So Trump met with Zelensky last week in Davos. What do you think is going on here, and how do you see all of this unfolding when it comes to Ukraine and Russia?
Simple fact is Ukraine is of no interest to the USA. It's not a strategic issue, never has been. The Europeans should have led on this, but they haven't paid their defense bills for the course of the last 20 years, so therefore they're in a mess. Russia's not going to be invading any further than the Ukrainian elements that it already has, or perhaps a little bit further across Ukraine. It's a bad day for Zelensky because ultimately he's timed out in terms of what he can possibly get from American assistance, and that therefore has got to make him very, very concerned. Although at the same time, Trump is going to be keen to try and clamp down on the Russians going forward, to wit, the Arctic Circle.
Well, Patrick, always great talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us as we kick off a new trading week.